So first of all, Professor, welcome back to the show. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Glad to be here, Danny.
And I'm just curious, even before we get into some of the details of this, what is it that caused you to publish this piece now, as opposed to any other time? Has something changed?
Well, I think that we are on the verge of a major war in the Middle East, and it looks like the United States is going to get dragged in, even though it doesn't want a major war in the Middle East, and we don't want to get dragged in. And the question is, why is this happening? And in my opinion, it's in large part because we are forced to support Israel to the point where Israel is pretty much free to do anything, and it can pursue provocative policies that end up dragging us into fights that we otherwise don't want to fight. And this, of course, raises the obvious question, why is this happening? And my argument is that it's due to the Israel lobby. And as you know, Steve Walt and I wrote a very famous article on this subject in 2006, and then we wrote a book in 2007, and more recently, in fact, a month ago, a new and important book by Ilan Pappé came out dealing with the Israel lobby. And I think those two books together tell you an enormous amount about how the lobby influences American foreign policy. Well, it's very important to understand that the United States has tremendous leverage over Israel that not only grows from the fact that we are the most powerful state on the planet, economically and militarily, but it's also essential to understand that Israel is dependent on us diplomatically, economically, and militarily. If you think about all the discourse today about how Israel is going to deal with a forthcoming Iranian attack on the state of Israel, the United States is deeply involved in helping Israel to fend off that attack, just as it helped Israel to fend off that attack on April 14th of 2024. Furthermore, we have given Israel this year $18 billion in aid. And we have also given to Israel huge amounts of weaponry that have allowed it to conduct the genocide in Gaza. And we have defended it diplomatically at every turn. So the United States has huge amounts of leverage that it can use to get Israel to change its policy on all sorts of issues. And we hardly ever do that. And we certainly don't do it when it comes to a two-state solution. And as all those clips make clear, we understand that from an American point of view, and also from what we think is in Israel's interest, it would make sense to move to a two-state solution. So you would expect, in normal circumstances, the United States would use its leverage to get Israel to do that. We do not do that. And then the $64,000 question becomes, why? And the answer is quite simple. It's because of the enormous, and I mean enormous power of the Israel lobby in the United States. Israel has a set of supporters in this country. It includes particular people and it includes particular institutions who work overtime to make sure that the United States supports whatever Israel wants. And in other words, we support Israel unconditionally. That's the basic U.S. policy towards Israel. And as I say, it is driven in large part by the lobby. We are not here acting in the American national interest. If we were acting in the American national interest vis-a-vis the two-state solution, we would have long ago forced Israel to accept the two-state solution. We certainly had the power to do that, but we've never even come close to that. We've never seriously tried to do that. And you want to ask yourself again, why? And the answer is the lobby. Look, the United States does not want a war with Iran at all. And on April 1st, the Israelis attacked the Iranian embassy in Baghdad, Syria, or in Damascus, Syria, excuse me. And that precipitated a conflict that involved the United States fighting against Iranian missile attacks. We got out of that one pretty much unscathed. And then the Israelis on July 31st assassinated Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. And this is what we believe is going to lead Iran to attack Israel and bring us back into another conflict, the dimensions of which are not clear at this point, with Iran. We don't want this conflict. We're doing everything we can to tell the Iranians and the Israeli to cool their jets. We don't want the Iranians to attack Israel. But how did we end up in this mess? It's very simple. We ended up in this mess because the Israelis dragged us in, knowing full well that we did not want a conflict with Iran. What does this tell you? The Israelis pretty much do what they want, and they know they can get away with it. They know that, the Biden administration will just go along with whatever they do and come up with excuses for Israel's behavior. You don't see any evidence of the United States putting the strong arm on the Israelis to stop antagonizing the Iranians in ways that will drag us into a war with Iran. You would expect that if normal international politics were at play here. But that's not the case. This is not normal international politics. The United States' relationship with Israel is unparalleled in history. You cannot find a case where a small country has this kind of influence, almost control over U.S. foreign policy toward that country, like we have in this particular case. It's really, truly amazing. And of course, it's not in the American national interest.
How does the Israeli lobby transition or translate their desires for this tiny state, as Bennett said earlier, to this global superpower, to where we are literally powerless at every level, military, diplomatic, and at the head of state, to do anything except for whatever the smaller guy says? How does that happen?
Well, there are basically two processes at play here. One is that the lobby goes to enormous lengths to put pressure on policymakers and politicians. It's especially effective at doing that in Congress, as we saw when Prime Minister Netanyahu came and addressed Congress on July 24th. You saw all those senators and Congress people giving him, I think, 58 standing ovations. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And by the way, that was the fifth time he had appeared before Congress. Huge influence on the policy-making process. And this is done through a variety of ways. One is just campaign contributions. To get elected to the White House, to get elected to Congress, you need lots of money. You need campaign contributions. And the lobby is set up to provide campaign contributions to people who support Israel. And if people don't support Israel, they'll fund or support campaigns of politicians who are pro-Israel, and they'll do everything they can to unseat those politicians who are critical of Israel. Furthermore, if you want a career at the senior level in government, if you were ever to be critical of Israel, the lobby would go to great lengths to make sure that you didn't get high-level positions in the government. This, of course, is what happened to Chaz Freeman. The lobby moved in to prevent him from assuming a very important position in the Obama administration because they fully understood that he was critical of Israel. He was not anti-Israel. He was just critical of Israel. But if you're
John, I want to show people that if people have not seen, some of this is breaking news just over the last single night, in that it's not just campaign contributions, but the Israeli lobby actually puts large numbers of dollars to directly influence American electoral outcomes. And so we have most recently seen this with Rep. Cori Bush. And I'm first of all going to show you what she has said, one example of what she had said that put her in the crosshairs of the Israeli lobbies. So she knew she was coming into the crosshairs. Like you'd mentioned what happened to Chaz Freeman. And there had been another, I think it was New York Democratic congressman who was not in the pocket of the Israeli side. And so they spent $15 million in a Democratic primary to make sure that he didn't get reelected. Now, you could say at that time, well, he had enough problems of his own. He did a bunch of other kind of strange things that put him at risk anyway. But that $15 million sure went over the top. This time, they spent $8 million again in a primary. Is astounding figure. But here's the bigger question, or here's the bigger issue at stake. When you see all these other members of Congress from whichever party, if they don't follow suit with what they're told to do by the Israeli lobbies, there is a legit price to pay. It's not an empty threat that they may come after you, and they are doing this. And again, this is so amazing. And one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight your work here, because this is counter to Americans, our own political system. I mean, we talked about, we get mad at the Russians because they wanted to influence allegedly in the 2016 election, and other people want to try to do this.
Let me make 2 points. First of all, it's just very important to understand that people in the lobby believe that what is good for Israel is good for the United States. So they're not pushing policies that they think are bad for the United States and good for Israel. You and I might think that, but they don't believe that. They believe that anything that's good for Israel is good for the United States. We're effectively joined at the hip. I think this is a remarkably naive view, but it is the view I believe that almost all of them hold. Now, with regard to the deterrent effect, there's no question that when you look at the Cori Bush case, that has a huge deterrent effect. Other people on Capitol Hill or people who want to run for Congress or the Senate someday, they understand full well what happens to you if you end up criticizing Israeli policy or the U.S.-Israeli relationship, or you criticize the lobby. They understand that full well, and therefore they end up supporting Israel unconditionally. This is the way it works. So what happened with Cori Bush and earlier with the congressman from New York that you referenced sends a very important message around the country to existing politicians and aspiring politicians. It has, in other words, huge deterrent effect. I think the fact is, if Israel wants to do something or wants something from us, it'll be a very rare case where the lobby doesn't support Israel, and Israel pretty much gets everything it wants.
But some of these voices aren't from the lobby per se. It's from American voices. And so my question is, I guess, more specific. Does the lobby inform some of these people what they should say, or do they just give them money and sit back and they'll say it on their own?
Well, there's no question that the lobby works carefully to cultivate close relationships with people on Capitol Hill and people in the executive branch, and they talk all the time. In many cases, people from the lobby will tell policymakers or people on Capitol Hill what they want. But I would imagine most cases, they don't even have to say anything. That people can infer what the lobby wants or what Israel wants, and they act accordingly.
Now, here's an interesting dynamic as well. I think that many people in the United States, certainly probably anybody who's watching our show right now, can see that, I mean, you see cause and effect. So you see that, okay, they give money, they get the result from the American politicians they want, or if they don't get it, then they have the Cori Bush effect where they literally get them driven out of power. But outside of the United States, some people aren't so sure about that. In fact, here is Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. After Haniyeh was assassinated on July 31st, he's like, yeah, it's not the lobby. It's actually the American government. That's actually what they want. But I'm not sure how he would square the fact that we say one thing, but then something else happens, unless he thinks that's just part of a deception plan. But I think it kind of shows what I think might be some of your bigger concern is that the confusion that this may cause makes conflict in the Middle East possibly more likely.
Well, I think, Danny, what's going on here is when you ask the question, why does the United States support Israel unconditionally? You really have two sets of answers. One answer or one set of answers comes from people like me and Steve Walt. And the argument there is that it's the Israel lobby. There are a number of other people who are on the other side of this debate, and it was reflected in these comments that you just played, who believe that it is American policy that is driving the train, and Israel is basically carrying out the wishes of the United States. Nasrallah just can't believe that a country as powerful as the United States would be controlled in any meaningful way by Israel, or that Israel would have this kind of influence on the United States. That's just not possible, right? So the idea that there's an Israel lobby is an argument that he doesn't buy. He believes if the United States wanted to get its way with Israel, given how powerful it is and given how dependent Israel is on the United States, that we could get Israel to dance to our tune. That's his view. And I think that he's simply wrong. And as I pointed out in the question of the day piece from my Substack that you put up on the screen, you can see in these 6 different instances that are all, hot button issues today, that the United States wants one thing and the Israelis want a different thing. And in all 6 of those cases, the Israelis are getting their way. And that's at odds with the argument that Nasrallah was making. And it's at odds with what he was saying, because he doesn't understand just how powerful the lobby is.
Right. And actually, I want to run back to that because there was a couple of other things that I wanted to go to, because I think it's really important. Your 5th and 6th ones, you say 5th, the Biden administration seeks to avoid a widening conflict between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel, fearing the situation could escalate into a regional war and the United States might be dragged into the fight. And 6, the Biden administration has a deep-seated interest in stable Middle East. Now, that should be self-evident that's what the United States should be. Any administration wants that kind of thing. But these actions, to me, really are pretty conclusively working counter to that. So what can the administration do to break through this, especially if they can see that, yes, I know that there's an Israeli lobby. Yes, I know that they have a lot of money that can contribute to my campaign. And especially heading into November, I can't afford to lose anybody on the Israeli side, but I also can't afford to lose anybody on the Palestinian side who are among the Democratic voters. But if he gets into a war, if there's a war that could literally start overnight or any time in the near coming future that could draw us into a war, that would be profoundly worse than an electoral defeat. Is there any chance you see that this can be broken through in time to prevent these outcomes?
No, just not going to happen. All you have to do is look at the historical record. You showed all those clips where people were talking about a 2-state solution going back to Barack Obama. We could take it all the way back to Jimmy Carter. Presidents have been pushing a 2-state solution for a long, long time, and we were never able to do anything about it. And we're not going to be able to do anything here. We're basically helpless. And if a war breaks out and we're in really bad shape as a result of that war, we won't blame Israel. We'll blame the Iranians. It's just the way it works.
So I'm looking back here at your comment here. On this, you say, to make matters worse, neither Congress nor Republican leaders nor mainstream media has pushed the Biden administration to pressure Israel to make these meaningful changes. So I wonder if you could now kind of change tack a little bit here and explain to us a little bit about how this Israeli lobby actually came to have the influence it does, because it didn't used to. This has not been the case all the time or forever. If you could explain to us how this developed in the first place.
Well, there was a lobby in 1948 when we recognized Israel, and there's no question that lobby put significant influence on Harry Truman to recognize the state of Israel. There's no question that inside the administration, there were people like George Marshall who were not in favor of that policy, but they lost, and they lost in part because of Truman's decision to support Israel, and his decision was influenced by the lobby. I think that almost everybody agrees that the lobby back then, and certainly in the 1950s and 1960s, was nowhere near as powerful as it has become over time. I think that it was in the early 1980s when the lobby really began to pick up a head of steam in terms of gaining power in the American political system. But the point is, it was always there, and it's always wielded significant influence.
Well, let me back up a little bit here. Help us to understand who is the Israeli lobby. I keep hearing that phrase like it's this shadowy figure somewhere that no one really knows who they are. Who constitutes the Israeli lobbies? Is it just a handful of really rich people? Is it a whole bunch of wealthy people? I mean, how is it formed?
I want to be clear, there's nothing shadowy about this. The lobby operates out in the open. Again, it's, a completely legal and legitimate.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean shadowy figure as though unethical. I mean shadowy figure in terms of people don't know who they are.
Well, I think most people know who they are. You were talking about AIPAC before, and almost everybody knows about AIPAC at this point in time. And AIPAC is probably the most powerful institution in the lobby. Well, AIPAC is an organization that has a whole structure of administrators, and then it has a large number of people around the country, mostly Jews, who are members of AIPAC. They donate money to AIPAC, and they work for AIPAC, usually without pay. I mean, they're volunteers. They're people who, belong to the organization and volunteer their time. It's basically an interest group. It's not much different than the National Rifle Association or the AFL-CIO. It's an American lobby, an American interest group. We don't have to like what it does, and I don't like what it does because I think it pushes policies, and I want to be very clear here, that are not in America's interest and are also not in Israel's interest. And by the way, Barack Obama understood full well that what Israel was doing in rejecting a two-state solution with the support of the lobby was going to lead to disaster for Israel. And he, of course, is correct. So I think that the lobby, and this includes organizations like AIPAC, the lobby is pushing policies that are not in America's interest or not in Israel's interest. But again, you want to understand that what it's doing is legitimate. Now, AIPAC is not the only organization. There are all sorts of other organizations like the Zionist Organization of America, the World Jewish Congress, on, and or the American Jewish Congress, and on. And then there are all sorts of individuals like Sheldon Adelson, who has now passed away, who in his day wielded huge influence on Donald Trump. So it's a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that work together in a loose way to support Israel no matter what, or to support Israel unconditionally.
Now, as I've said, I say on other episodes where I talk about the Middle East war here, is that Netanyahu, in my estimation, militarily, has Israel on a course that cannot succeed because he cannot accomplish with military power the political outcome he desires, or he says he desires, which is peace for the people of Israel. And I have long argued that the path that could make that possible is there has to be a possibility for the Palestinian side to have at least a possibility of a hope of a future where they can live in peace as well. And I said, if you don't have both of them with at least that possibility, then you'll have it for neither of them. So I argued that that's the case here. And now that it looks like Netanyahu, separate from AIPAC, separate from the lobby, Netanyahu has his country on a path right now that could drag all of us into a war and be terrible for everyone here. And my concern is, as you pointed out a second ago, you may have already answered this question really, is that there doesn't appear to be the political courage and the leadership of individuals necessary to stand up to the lobby and to try to tell them, I get it. You guys want good things for Israel. So do I. This won't get it done. We're going to change course. I think that is one possibility that could make a change. But as you unfortunately accurately said, I don't know that anyone's going to have that kind of courage to take the risk.
I think you're dreaming, Danny.
Okay, fair enough.
you might wish that this is going to happen, but please don't hold your breath, because it's just not going to happen. There's just nobody in America who has the courage to stand up to the lobby. I mean, it's pretty obvious after all these years that nobody's going to stand up and really take on the lobby.
So what do you think would happen? What do you think would happen if the trends that appear to be playing out do, and that there is a spark of a big Middle East war that because of the way it works out, it's self-evident that it harms Israel and it harms American interest. God only knows where it could go, because there's all kinds of negative possibilities. Might people looking at the rubble on the other side look back and wonder, why didn't any of you guys stand up and do the right thing at the time, and then change that so that maybe the lobby won't have as much influence going forward?
Look, if you follow this issue in the mainstream media, the story that is told over and over, especially in places like the Wall Street Journal, is that Iran is responsible for all of the trouble. The Israelis are the good guys, the bad guys. And anything negative that results from a war involving the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other side, and maybe Hezbollah as well, is going to be portrayed as a war that was caused by the axis of evil. They're the forces of darkness and we're the forces of light. I mean, you know the story. That's in the mainstream media. Now, the problem that the lobby faces and Israel faces is that we have all these alternative platforms, of which your podcast is one. And on these alternative platforms, you have people like me and people like you who are telling a different story, and who are saying that if you look carefully at what's going on here, the bad guys are not the Iranians. This is not to portray them as, the children of lightness or anything like that, the children of light. It's just to say that, if you want to know who's really causing all of this trouble in the Middle East today, it's the Israelis. And so you have two narratives out there. And the question is, in the tug of war between these narratives over time, how does the balance of power change? I think the balance of power has shifted against the mainstream media over time, because in the past, you didn't have all these alternative platforms like your podcast, and the number of alternative platforms is growing. The number of people who don't believe hardly anything that they hear from the mainstream media is growing. And the end result is it's becoming tougher for Israel and the lobby and for mainstream politicians and policymakers to blame Iran, pure and simple, and get away with it. But how this plays out over time is hard to say at this juncture. Furthermore, the idea that Donald Trump was tougher on the Iranians than Joe Biden, and that all of our troubles can be traced to President Biden because he was a pussycat in terms of dealing with Iran, is not a serious argument. The fact is, the United States across the board has been tough with regard to Iran, and that's in large part because of pressure from Israel and from pressure from the lobby. The fact is, there's just not much we can do with Iran to take away its military capability to retaliate if the Israelis provoke an attack. And the Israelis provoked the first attack when they attacked Damascus, the Iranian embassy in Damascus on April 1st. And the forthcoming attack was provoked by Israel as well. You want to understand here that both the Iranians and the Americans have no interest in fighting each other. We don't want this war. And in fact, the attack by the Iranians on April 13th, what was going on there is that the Iranians had coordinated with the Americans to make sure that the attack was limited, and that the Americans and the Israelis had an opportunity to see what was coming and knock down most of the missiles and most of the drones, right? The Iranians were cooperating with us, and we were cooperating with the Iranians because we did not want the conflict to spin out of control. Again, the United States and Iran have no interest in a major war. it's the Israelis who are trying to drag us into a war. This is why they attacked the Iranian embassy on April 1st, and it's why they hit Haniyeh on July 31st. And now we have a situation where the Iranians have said they're not going to coordinate with us to limit the attack, and they're going to come full force after Israel.
What do you expect to happen? What is your best guess on what Iran may do in terms of scale?
Well, I think that they probably will have at least two waves, and General Keane was saying that, right? I think last time it was just one wave. I think this time there'll be two waves, and I think it'll be much more difficult this time for us, meaning the United States and Israel, working together with a number of other countries as well, to limit the damage. I think it's quite clear that the Israelis used up a significant number of their missiles, their air defense missiles last time.
Right.
And we're beginning to run low ourselves. Right. And the Iranians are not going to pull any punches this time. They're going to come after us hammer and tong.
Now, what worries me is that the last one, I think that with only one exception, and may not have been any, there were no Israeli casualties. No one was killed. But if Iran does what you suggest here, it's likely that there's going to be some Israeli deaths this time. What might they do in response to that?
Well, I think the Israelis will definitely retaliate, and they will retaliate in a serious way. You want to remember, the Israelis retaliated last time after the April 13th attack by Iran. They retaliated on April 19th, and it was a very small retaliation. They went after a radar, a single radar. And the reason that their retaliation was so limited was because we put enormous pressure on them to limit the retaliation. This is the April 19th retaliation. But here, I think the Israelis will retaliate in a massive way against the Iranians. And then you want to ask yourself the question, Danny, what will the Iranians then do? And our great fear last time, and I'm sure it's our great fear this time, is that the Iranians will launch another massive strike against Israel. And then you want to ask yourself the question, what will the Israelis do? And we go up the escalation ladder. Where it stops is who knows, right?
And then we have to throw into that potentially a new rung on that ladder of Russia, because you had Sergei Shoigu was just there, and apparently many military transports were also accompanying him with unknown cargo. So how do you see that potentially playing into this whole mess?
Let me make 2 points there. One is it's quite clear that what's going on is that the Russians are giving the Iranians sophisticated radars and air defense assets with a strike by the Israelis on Iran. But what you also want to remember is the Hezbollah angle. The assassination in Tehran was just one assassination. The assassination of Haniyeh, that was one. But there was also an assassination of a Hezbollah leader in Beirut. And most people expect that if Iran and Israel get into it, that at the same time, Hezbollah and Israel will get into it. Hezbollah has somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 rockets and missiles that are aimed at Israel. If Hezbollah unleashes any substantial portion of that arsenal, at the same time, Iran is attacking Israel with drones and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, one can only wonder sort of how this one ends, and how much damage will be done to Israel, how much damage will be done to Lebanon, especially Beirut, and how much damage will be done to Iran. It's really quite frightening to think about what this war will look like if it begins to spin out of control. And you can tell all sorts of plausible stories about how it does spin out of control.
Right. Yeah, that's the problem. Is there's no shortage of different ways this could go sideways. I mean, it can go anywhere from catastrophic to only really bad. But I can't think of any good scenarios It just doesn't seem. It seems like we used up our one lucky stroke on April. On the April the 18th or whenever that was that they struck back, and we didn't get any escalation then. It's just hard for me to imagine how we get another stroke of luck.
You can make that argument, but this takes us back to my memo. My memo raises the question, given this nightmare scenario that you and I are describing, which surely lots of smart people understand, why isn't the United States going to great length, right, to put pressure on the Israelis to not do this sort of thing anymore? And why aren't we, making promises of one sort or another to the Iranians that we will corral the Israelis in the future so that we can prevent this outcome? But if you look at our behavior, we've done remarkably little to corral the Israelis. And the end result is we're in this disastrous situation.
We do, and that's exacerbated by people like Keene and a number of others that keep going on major networks that I keep seeing. You talk about the alternative nets like ours, which is growing, but it's still just a fraction of what like any Fox News or CNN or MSNBC is going to have on there. And when so many people see all these alleged experts sitting there saying all these things, they think it must be true. So there's not any pushback or so, and it just keeps to this cycling in this bad direction. There's no off ramps. I don't see one.
No, there are no off ramps. I mean, we want to go back to a point that I think you made few minutes ago, and you said that Israel has no real solution to this problem. They're in a real mess. They're in a terrible situation, and they have no way out. And this has huge ramifications for the United States because we're joined at the hip with Israel. And if Israel has no way out, this means that the situation in the Middle East is not going to go away, or this trouble in the Middle East, from our point of view, is not going to go away anytime soon, because it's not going to go away anytime soon for Israel. And again, what's happening to Israel matters enormously to us. And the Israeli response to this is to just up the ante and use more military force. The Israelis are addicted, or at least they seem to be addicted, to the idea that when you get in trouble, reach for the gun. And you have to ask yourself then, does this solve the problem? And as you were saying before, it does not solve the problem. Indeed, it makes the problem worse. That's what's going on here. The Israelis are in effect in a hole, and they're digging deeper and deeper. This is what happens when you get into trouble and you think that military force is a solution, and it is not the solution. And indeed, it just makes the situation worse. That's what's happening here. The Israelis are making a bad situation worse, but we cannot do anything to stop them. And indeed, because we're joined at the hip with them via the lobby, we are using a shovel alongside of them to help them dig deeper and deeper, and help ourselves to dig deeper and deeper.
Yeah, that's hard to argue with any of that, even if I don't like any of the outcomes. But things are what they are. We're going to continue to watch this. If anybody wants to know more about the Israeli lobby, there's the book on the screen right there that John kept talking about here. Of course, do suggest that you go to his Substack at mearsheimer.substack.com. So that you can also catch up on anything else he has. You can sign up for that and be on his mailing list as well. Professor, we always appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much for providing such sharp clarity on this topic.
You're welcome, Danny.